So, once again, welcome and thank you for joining the second conversation in this series. In the first session, we looked closely at one instrument, which was the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement's Digital Trade Protocol. Today, we are widening the lens because the issues most of us work on, such as data protection, AI governance, and platform accountability, do not exist in a vacuum. They sit inside what we can call a trade architecture that was largely settled before we even arrived, and that continues to shape what our governments can and cannot do in the conditions of the trade agreements that they do get into. AGOA, or the Africa Growth Opportunities Act, is our way into this conversation today. It is on course for a 3-year extension to the end of 2028, having passed both chambers in Washington and now awaiting final approval from the House of Representatives. Whichever way that lands, it tells us that a program that a good part of Africa's export economy depends on has spent the better part of a year suspended in a legislative process that no African negotiator sits inside. We had an opportunity to submit comments on the renewal of AGOA, but very few of us were aware, and an even smaller group participated, especially those dealing in the digital economy. That is really the theme of the conversation we're going to have today. Trade decisions are increasingly being taken at the political level, above and around the technical negotiators, and civil society tends to arrive after the fact, responding to outcomes rather than participating in shaping them. So, the question I want us to sit with over the next hour or so is a frank one. Does the digital rights community need to become a direct constituency in trade negotiations? And if so, what would that actually take? And with that, let me bring in our panelists. And how I will be doing that is I will be introducing each panelist and asking them a question immediately so that you get to know them as we move on. Okay. So our first panelist is Nadia Hasham. And the question that I have for you in opening the webinar is who actually in the room when negotiating positions are formed, or rather, who is actually in the room? And at what point are the decisions that matter already effectively taken? Your vast experience with negotiators and with the AfCFTA would be a great insight to this process. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melissa, for inviting me to join this interesting discussion and with this interesting group as well, and a really unique topic that I think deserves more attention on the participation of civil society and private sector in trade negotiations. To your point directly, and I'll speak as you said to my experience with the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. In a context of those negotiations, we have 54 state parties to the agreement, and they all need to come to a common position. And this, of course, can be quite difficult. What they need to do is go back to their national contexts, understand what their national priorities are, and understand the position of their private sector, and what provisions are actually going to make it easier for their private sector to stimulate investment, value addition, scaling production, improving standards to be able to meet the requirements of the markets that they are trying to trade with, and what provisions are not going to support that or are going to hinder it. And that requires quite a bit of quite extensive consultations with the private sector and understanding of the private sector. And so that starts with the civil service. So that's really, in our case in Kenya, the State Department for Trade, the trade experts that are there, the trade negotiators that are there, and they have expertise on particular issues. They have they have experience not only with engaging with the private sector, but also understanding the national trade priorities and other national priorities and strategies that are in place. And for them, they really need an entry point into the private sector. And so their counterparts then become the associations, the private sector associations or the civil society organizations that are able to collectively come to a common position and share that and present that with the trade negotiators, with the government, so with the ministries or the relevant state departments. And that is often challenging. It might be difficult for the private sector to really know what is within the scope of a trade agreement, what can the negotiators actually negotiate against, and what can they advocate for, and what are the limits of what they can do. And in our work with the AfCFTA, what we tried to do was overcome this barrier, especially when you're dealing with technical issues. And so, for instance, if we talk about digital trade, which has a technical component to it of understanding the digital landscape and understanding what's actually going on in the digital ecosystem. We did it in the case of gender and youth issues, and that has a technical dimension as well. So what we tried to do was build a framework that integrates capacity building into the public-private dialogue. So we look at what has been done already, what are the existing gaps, because we're not operating in a vacuum, and then what is the evidence that we can apply to that, and can we really look at understanding the technical issues a little bit better, because the extent to which the technical issues are understood is what's going to affect the ability of the trade negotiators to leverage their position and to advocate for the private sector and alongside government priorities in the trade negotiations. So this is what usually happens. And then we have the implementation side, which is, national committees and trade facilitation committees at the national levels that are responsible for implementing what is decided in the trade agreement. And most of the time, those committees, or all the time actually, those committees have private sector representatives. And again, here, your private sector needs to be quite well organized to take part in that. And you need to have those channels of communication with organized private sector groups to be able to access that. However, in this case, in the AGOA case, we are not actually looking at a trade negotiation. We are looking at an act in the U.S. government, and so this means that the so-called trade partners, which again are many African countries, around 30. Have less influence, or almost no influence. There's no direct bilateral negotiation happening here. We've seen in some cases the US try to pursue bilateral trade agreements with some of these countries, Kenya being an example. But for AGOA specifically, it is really up to the discretion of the U.S. lawmakers. And what it tries to do is not necessarily to look at free trade, but it's looking at preferential trade. So not necessarily removing all the tariffs, but trying to relax some of them in exchange for some values that of a free market and a rule of law and labor rights and eliminating non-tariff barriers. So there is a power asymmetry. So the negotiation process that I discussed does not work exactly the same way. However, there are a couple of avenues, one being leveraging counterparts in the U.S. private sector to lobby on that side. There have been also extensive bilateral consultations with U.S. counterparts of various African governments. And then there's also the option that the U.S. government opened of collecting comments. And here is where we sort of fall down a little bit, because our comments, I can take the example of Kenya. We had 3 comments out of more than 120, which is not bad. But if we look collectively, most of the comments come from the private sector, come from the U.S. private sector.
Yes.
So maybe we can talk a bit more about that.
Yes. So I love that. And I want you to pause there, because now I want us to get into what AGOA exactly is a little bit more. And for this, I'm going to ask Faith Chalangat to join us. And my question to you, Faith, is simply, what is AGOA and what does AGOA actually contain? And what would this extension to 2028 change in practice for the eligible African countries? Over to you, Faith.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa, and hi, everyone. I'd really like to pick up from where Nadia left. She left it at a very strategic point to actually bring in the conversation about AGOA. So simply put, and not too much technical terms, AGOA is a unilateral preference program between the US and select sub-Saharan African countries. So it's not all African countries to say. And as of now, due to annual review eligibilities, we have active 32 active sub-Saharan African countries that are actually participating under the AGOA. And just to break down a bit about the anatomy of AGOA. So one, it is a unilateral preference agreement. So it means that it's only duty-free access goods allowed into the US markets from these select sub-Saharan African countries. So technically, the US we don't give the US anything. They give us the duty-free access into their markets. And when you look at that, it means that there is a bit of power play in this kind of agreement. So when we talk about negotiations, it's more about who is on top of the other. And technically, the US is giving these African countries a lot of access into the market, which brings about the whole conversation on what are we negotiating towards a bilateral US-Africa trade framework or specific African countries who are trying to negotiate with the US. And then number two, when I talk about the anatomy, I will talk about the accumulation and the value addition aspect, where the AGOA actually allows a 35% local value addition in these beneficiary sub-Saharan African countries. Leads me now to the rule called the third country fabric rule, which allows select sub-Saharan African countries to source yarn and fabric from other markets. And this actually was a big play of what the conversations on renewing AGOA were on, because according to a lot of research from the United States Trade Representative, the USTR, African countries were not actually the beneficiaries of AGOA. It looked, and statistics show that Asian countries where Africans could source fabric and yarn were the countries that were actually benefiting from AGOA. So the whole conversation about African countries requiring another round of AGOA was then becoming a bit challenged and more technical, because one, you guys are sourcing yarn and fabric from other countries. So you really cannot explain and tell us that these are raw materials coming back from your own country. So these two, the value addition aspect and the third country fabric rule, were a bit among the issues that were raised during the conversation on why then would we need to, renew AGOA for the second time. So when you think about AGOA, the whole agreement would be, it's a non-reciprocal. It's the US giving us duty-free access into the markets. And when you talk about the roadway, which is, I would say I would be a bit controversial to say that I accept, as a trade lawyer, that AGOA has served its purpose. It has given Africans what we needed. We needed the access into the US market, and we have had that. What we need to do right now is sit and look at the agreements that we have as Africa. We have the AfCFTA that is in the books, but what are we doing about that? And if you would allow me, Melissa, I think that would be a good way to actually conclude by saying that it's not moving away from AGOA, really. It's more reducing dependency and more building more regional value chains within Africa.
Wow, Faith. Okay, so you took us really in depth into AGOA, and you've left us with a question about, we have AfCFTA and we also have AGOA. Do we know why we have both of them, and what purpose are they serving? And I really like that you touched on apparel, right? Textiles and apparels, because I think that's the major thing that Africans are doing with AGOA. But now let's get into the conversation about digital trade, because we know AfCFTA does really talk about digital trade. AGOA seems to be still within the physical space. For this, I want to bring in Chiti Mutati, and I want Chiti to give us a different perspective, the CSO perspective. We've heard about private sector, and I want to hear about CSOs. Chiti, please do come and join us for this conversation. And the first question I'd like you to speak on from a civil society vantage point on how trade agreements shape program work is, has trade policy already constrained your work without ever being named? And how have you navigated that, if that is actually the case?
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. It's quite funny because many years ago, like well over a decade actually, when I had just graduated, one of my first roles was working within a trade policy unit of a UN organization. And at the time, I was looking at trade policy focused on the ASEAN region. And it's been very interesting to come back to this and to note the shift in the topics and the impacts we were looking at then compared to now, as countries are increasingly focusing on digital economies. So now within my work in a digital rights focused CSO, I see how we still face some challenges around ensuring that we are part of the conversation. We're in the rooms where decisions are being made around trade policy and its impacts from a digital rights and digital inclusion perspective. Also around getting governments to kind of meaningfully prioritize our concerns around equitable benefits for all stakeholders and rights protections within their larger trade agendas. Now, if we're speaking to so for example, one of the starkest examples I can share around how trade policy dynamics can impact our space and have impacted our space. Earlier this year, an organization called Access Now was due to hold an event called RightsCon in Zambia. And if you think about it, RightsCon is the largest convening for all stakeholders on digital rights. And it cuts across civil society, the media fraternity, private sector, government. It's a convening for all those spaces to come in and discuss key digital rights and inclusion issues of our time. Now, the event was canceled just a few days before it was to hold. And it was actually cancelled by the Zambian government, who, through one of its ministries, the Ministry of Technology and Science, was actually a partner of the organization. Now, Access Now actually released a statement explaining that they had informally been informed that the government had received some pressure from China, who is actually a key trade and investment partner of Zambia. And informally, again, this was communicated according to Access Now, that there were issues around the participation of Taiwanese civil society, as well as some of the themes which were planned for discussion at RightsCon. So naturally, this was a really huge blow to our community and quite significant, especially at a time now in the digital rights civil society space, but also the broader civil society space, where we're facing so many challenges around funding declines, platform accountability, different players limiting their roles and responsibilities within the digital world, and increasing rights violations. So RightsCon was really that space for civil society to really, convene. And in terms of navigating the constraints, I think the key word I've seen from our sector really is just the resilience. Getting up, re-strategizing, continuing to convene in smaller spaces through policy briefs, through spaces such as this, for example. But at a practical level, I think, and at a local level, it's also been very important for us to reframe our messaging, right? As well as our approach to engaging with these issues, engaging with governments and engaging with different bodies, getting them to see us more as partners and really taking up that space in these rooms. Sensitizing them to the issues we're raising and the impacts that we are seeing. And then also engaging around how digital rights, the respect for digital rights, can and should still work hand in hand with development through these trade agreements. So yeah, I think that's really in a nutshell what we've been facing in our work.
Thank you so much, Chiti, for giving us a live example of how geopolitics is also entering this conversation about trade and the direct effects of that this year that we all felt the pinch on, which was the cancellation of RightsCon. Some people are still trying to recover from the costs of that. And I like that we're now asking questions about what are the conditions around these trade agreements and what are they actually doing to us on the ground. And to bring a bigger perspective of that, I want to now introduce Mustafa Mahmoud Yusuf, who is the director of Namati's citizenship program based in Nairobi. Mustafa, please come up to the podium because I have a very practical question for you. I want you to come in with more broad reflections as a co-director of a civil society organization. And from where you sit, I'd like to know, what is the honest state of civil society capacity on trade issues?
Honestly, for many CSOs, trade is not our area of work. That is what we think. We leave it to the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. The normal people that we see, the likes of KOTU, because we assume that they're the ones who are in charge of doing such projects. Unfortunately, that is far from the truth. It affects us all directly or indirectly. I like what Nadia, it's Faith who said that there's nothing that the US wants from us. But what we've just said, there are invisible conditions that we didn't know of. Like, for example, because of partnership with the US, other techies from the US, tech companies from the US have exploited us. We have seen the likes of the WorldCoin that came, took biometrics from people, and nothing happened to them. And unfortunately, that's a classical example that as much as it could not be directly to trade, it's a violation of privacy, there's a violation of human rights that other people might be working on, and other exploitations that are there. So in my opinion, is that civil societies have been working in silos and they feel like trade is not their cup of coffee. Like, for example, as a person who has been working on digital ID rights, when we went to court to stop the Huduma number rollout, we didn't know how it will affect other areas of work. Because we went to court, some of the arguments that we were arguing is that there's lack of safeguards in terms of data protection. And little do we know, because we were not participating in the space of data protection, we didn't know where the data protection bill was. And we didn't know that for the past 5 years, it was stagnating. But because we went to court, other sectors of civil society working on digital rights and other rights were benefiting from one case. That's just an example. That sometimes you might sit back and say that this does not affect me, but in the other angle, it does affect you. And these are classical examples, for example, where one siloed organization was working this side, but it affected the other spectrum that was working on digital rights. So yeah, as I said before, many of us feel like trade does not concern us, but we forget there's a lot of human rights exploitation. There's gender abuses, there's sexual exploitation in the trade, and even licensing of companies, where there is also discrimination. And even me, as a person working on digital rights, I see that when we talk about digital trade, there's aspects of digital ID, which is the basis of everything. So as a person who's working on issues of digital rights, especially digital ID rights, if I sit back, I'll be doing a disservice to the whole nation, because we will not get it right. we will not be getting the digital trade right, because KYC, know your customer, is the foundation of all types of trade that we'll be doing. So if we don't get it right at the foundation of getting good IDs, well-documented citizens, and also issues of penetration of internet, we won't get right at the end of the tunnel, where is the trade being transacted.
Safa, for that passionate response. You started by admitting that you're not participating enough, but you've highlighted reasons why you need to participate. So I'm really enjoying that. And I want to tie these reasons back to AGOA. So I'm going to go back to Faith. And I want to ask Faith, when we hear about AGOA as essentially a preference program designed for goods, right? How then does digital trade, data flows, and digital services get involved? I think for the AfCFTA, which I'll get to back to Nadia in a minute, it's quite clear from the protocols. But from AGOA, which is an act from the US, how do these things translate? Maybe the conditions touch on aspects of digital trade? I'm not sure. Let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be very blunt. AGOA does not in any way touch on digital trade, data flows. There is no beneficial aspect to digital trade from Africa, or data flows, or cross-border data trading. What really happens is that if you look at, again, I say the anatomy of AGOA, it's more generalized system preference, where there was an additional of, I think, around 1,800 product eligibility. And you see, this is all based on trade in goods. It's based on the, how do I say, when we think about trading services, like the digital aspect of it, it's more on WTO's, what is it called? The General Agreement on Trade in Services. But this is AGOA product focused. But we cannot run away from the fact that, a good goods trade focused agreement has to intersect in a way with the digital aspects of it. So you'd expect that there is digitization of certificates of origin, there is digitization of cloud custom procedures, for example, goods being tracked digitally. So the aspect of digital trade does not, it is not far-fetched from AGOA and trade in goods. But the problem is there is no benefit, coming from top to bottom in a way. So what really happens is that AGOA works in more of the backward way when it comes to digital trade, trade in digital services, because what happens is that AGOA expects select sub-Saharan African countries to eliminate tariffs and trade barriers on goods that are going into the US market. So that means anything including data localization rules that really act as trade barriers need to be eliminated. So in a way, digital trade is not thriving in Africa because of AGOA. It's more limiting because now you have to create your data localization rules. You have to come up with digital service taxes, for example. I think this was a big thing last year or early this year, that you need to make sure that they are not in a way barring US trade and investment. So if there's anything data, trade, digital thriving in Africa, you need to bear in mind that it does not have in any way have to affect the US trade and investment in Africa. So in a way, I would say, is digital trade thriving in Africa because of AGOA? No, not in any way.
It is affected because of the conditions that AGOA
Absolutely.
is implementing.
Yes.
Okay, now that takes me to another question, and now I bring Nadia back into the conversation, right? You gave us a wonderful overview of what a negotiation process looks like, and in Africa we are negotiating as 50 plus countries and trying to find consensus, right? Which is the beauty of the AfCFTA. And I want to just continue to show that contrast between the AfCFTA and AGOA, which is an act from the US, right? So let's say what happens in a negotiation that never appears in the final text, right? How would members of civil society organizations, for example, know where to look for that negotiated factor that is missing in the final text? What would you advise them, or how would you teach these types of negotiators to handle this situation?
Yeah, thanks. A great question. And I'm glad we came back to the question of, it might seem like under AGOA, the US is giving us preferential access, but we are also expected to comply with certain standards as well. And I think Faith has beautifully explained that, how that relates to the digital trade regulations. And that is one of the things, to answer your question, Melissa, that does not appear in the text of the trade agreements. So when you do have the opportunity to negotiate a trade agreement, surprisingly, one of the sticking points could really be around the definitions. So the definitions of key terms, what does, when we say digital trade in this agreement, what does it actually cover? And what does it not cover? And we really learned that the hard way with women and youth in trade. What does gender-based violence cover, right? So I think that's right at the top. That's not even that's before you get to all the provisions. So even that agreement, and it is an opportunity to sort of scope out what do we think that this agreement or this particular chapter or protocol covers, or what do we not want it to cover. Of course, we don't have the opportunity to do that here under AGOA. The other thing is the aspects around the rules of origin. Faith touched on that. So how much of the product that you're trading needs to be made in the country or one of the countries to qualify for preferential trade access. So you can't, import something from China and then try to re-export it and then say that qualifies. It doesn't. Some portion of what you make does. And so you negotiate on what that proportion is. You negotiate on things like standards. You negotiate on things like the tariff schedules. So how quickly are we going to remove these tariffs or reduce the tariffs? You don't necessarily do it all overnight. And then what is the level of commitment in those provisions? So if we've agreed to do something, we can say that we are cooperating on it. We can say we encourage it. We can say that we must do it. All of the parties to the agreement shall do it. So this means that if you have a dispute settlement mechanism, that it falls within that dispute settlement mechanism, or otherwise it's just best endeavor. We'll try to do it if we can. So all of that language is also negotiated. And one interesting aspect is we tend to do this sort of copy and paste from other contexts and other trade agreements. So we say, okay, the EU has done this. Let's start from there. Not necessarily a bad thing, but when we talk about digital trade, the EU market has evolved very differently. Our market is dominated by SMEs, and of course we want to maintain that. So we might not want to take that approach, and that would be the same in this case. And then the trade agreement can be an opportunity to look at other things like trade and issues, what we usually call. So this can be sustainability, but also some of these backdoor provisions. And we've seen recently in the negotiations with Canada and the US that one of the reasons that they dropped the negotiations was a provision that was trying to be introduced to control what agreements the trade partner could have with other countries, with third-party countries. And so those can be extensions, and digital regulations, as Faith has said, can be framed as non-tariff barriers and fall under some of those things. So what you need to do is to look at the implementation strategies and the committees that are created, participate through your sector associations, other apex bodies, talk about, can we meet these market access requirements? What kind of national lobbying needs to be done? We didn't have that opportunity with the EU sustainability regulations, for example, that were also put on us, and AGOA is sort of similar in that respect. But let's look at the incentives for the target market, right? We know that some of the tariffs were relaxed because we produce things that the US doesn't. We can have investment opportunities as well for US companies. So what would that look like? What is domestically our opportunity to provide trade support services? And Faith has talked about some of those things as well, on digital trade facilitation, maybe on logistics. And if you still want to operate as a tech company in the US, it doesn't matter that it's not covered under AGOA. You can still try to do that under other trade agreements. So what is the impact on our private sector, and how can we leverage these opportunities? So I would say, like, look at the advocacy that can be done through the existing private sector groups in the US. Levi's, for example, imports a lot of textiles from our continent. They would be very supportive of this type of, continuing the AGOA provisions and improving them. Our other African private sector groups coming together, and bilateral consultations that are, as I said, happening with US counterparts. One question that you posed that maybe we can discuss later is like, can we negotiate as a bloc now that we have the AfCFTA? I don't want to give an answer to that now. I think we can, it's a longer discussion, but I think it's definitely something we should put on the table.
Okay. You've said, I think, things that are very interesting and would pique the interest, especially for those of you who are listening from Nairobi. You've heard about language, must, shall. I know in Nairobi, the people must or the people shall is one of the most understood monikers that we've had over the past year. So shall, must, can, will try, etc. Those are quite important in the negotiation process. So now I want to go back to Chiti. And Chiti, I'd like to ask you, we've heard about AfCFTA, we've heard about AGOA, and we've also heard about the interaction of other bilateral agreements. Where do you think civil society's attention would be best placed in terms of these trade agreements over the next 2 years? Why am I saying the next 2 years? Because of the extension of AGOA into 2028. What are your thoughts about where civil society should focus? Chiti, you're still muted.
There I am. So I was saying I really liked the example that Mustafa gave about the coalition building and the movement which came about from the Huduma number court case. And I think there's this tendency which can occur within our space where we work in these silos, and it's due to a number of factors. Some of them I talked about earlier, the funding crunch, capacity issues. And so we can kind of seem to focus on what look like the explicit or obvious digital rights issues. But, trade is really such a pervasive topic. The minute we're discussing these cross-border interactions or exchanges between countries, especially where they're including technology, we're already bringing ourselves within the ambit of digital rights and digital inclusion issues. So in terms of where civil society as a whole is best placed paying attention, I think it's around the sensitization around trade policy, trade issues, and how they impact our work. And this is important whether you are a digital rights organization like us, or you're focused on climate or health. I think as a civil society body, we all need to dig deeper into the impact of trade policy and all these agreements on our core remits and our missions and the work that we're doing. And we need to build that understanding across our organizations. Then, of course, it's important to build the necessary capacity to engage with these issues through the lens of our work and their impact on our work. And definitely spaces like this, I think we need to ramp them up a lot more. We need more trainings. We need more webinars such as these. We need spaces where we're convening and we're sharing ideas and learning, regardless of the immediate focus of your organization. But I think without the necessary insight into these agreements and the necessary understanding at a base level, and then their impact on our work, we really can't do the real work of civil society, which is focused on these commitments as they relate to our focus areas.
Thank you so much, Chiti. I really like the idea of the coalition building, and I am 100% with you in terms of more sensitization, which is exactly what this webinar is trying to do. So let's get back to Mustafa. Mustafa, you were quite vocal about the honest state of the capacity of civil society. So let me ask, following from what Chiti is saying, what would a trade-focused civil society constituency need to be more than just reactive, as you have said. So if you were implementing a trade-focused program at Namati around digital ID, what would you say you would need in order for that, to move you from a reactive stage to a proactive stage?
I think we need to have a movement that discusses trade and remove it from trade-focused organization or the trade-focused programs. Like, I look forward to maybe as a civil society having a unity of purpose to sit down on with our lenses as our strength to say, okay, Mustafa, you work on digital ID rights. How does it affect trade? How could you bring us to speed in terms of what are the safeguards that people working on issues of ID have been championing for, so that we could build up conversation on digital trade? Another person could come on issues of gender rights and issues of gender violations that are there, and those lenses are coming together to come up with better campaign messages. Like, for example, I'll still give an example of the time that CSOs had to pull up the resources together to unite for a common cause. They all saw the effect that a digital ID system could have brought to them. Issues of coercion, issues of data privacy, where we saw people's IDs being given left, right, and center. But everybody saw it was going to affect even children. So even children organizations saw the purpose. So CSOs need to come together and see that trade should be a cross-cutting issue, so that even if you're working on issues of gender, even if you're working on issues of land, let's see how do we bring the resources together to even have, even if it's every twice a year, conversations together in person to see, okay, where have we reached in terms of rollouts of ID? Where have we reached in terms of rollout of 3G connectivity? Where have we really reached in terms of electricity penetrations? So that every person who's in different sector comes and reports back, so that we can see, okay, when you're going to negotiate on issues of trade, or when you're going to negotiate on issues of digital protection, these are the priorities. But one thing is bringing us together, digital trade. And lastly, I wanted to say that we need to do more upskilling. The same way government is always investing into capacity building of their personnel working in these fields, we also need to be intentional. And I'll challenge CPIT to be the lead in terms of looking at where are the areas of upskilling CSOs, so that any person who has an opportunity to speak to a person who's going to influence decisions somewhere, we have common messages within the different lessons that we are working on. So maybe CPT could take up the challenge to see how do you upskill CSOs so that they stop looking at issues from their own lenses to look at it at a broader lens of trade, so that everybody brings the resources on board. And the other thing that we need to talk to donors also is the conversation of competition. As a person who saw how competition can undermine unity of purpose, because every donor is asking you for deliverables. They don't look at deliverables that are joint. They look at individual deliverables. So anyway, these are conversations that we need to have, a conversation with government, we need to have a conversation with donor community. So CPIT, you could play maybe the convening role, so that you could bring different actors and see how does the different angles of lenses that we hold connect to trade. And trade could be the glue that pieces everything together.
I love that.
And we'll stop being reactive.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mustafa. So you've challenged us, you've given us two challenges. One, which is broad, and that's removing the silo of putting things into a trade bucket, because trade is cross-cutting. So we need to not talk about digital ID in trade that is digital ID focused, but rather we talk about digital ID and have an aspect of trade involved in it on a natural spectrum. Thank you. I take that challenge to de-silo my mind and ensure that it's a running thread. Now, I have one last round of questions for the panelists. But before I do that, I'm going to ask questions that the audience has. I'm seeing one is a question, one is a comment. So I'll start with the question. And this is from Ayanda Mpofu. And she asks, or she says, apologies for the length of my questions, but I am interested in hearing what the panelists' thoughts are on how do we meaningfully safeguard African value chains in a context where key digital and physical infrastructure is foreign-owned and externally governed. In the case of AGOA, where participation often requires engagement through US-controlled platforms, standards, and forums, how should African states think about benefit in terms of these agreements? Is it enough to access the market, or do we need to rethink what advantage looks like when the rules and the digital gateways are not ours? And ultimately, how do we negotiate trade arrangements that promote digital inclusion while acknowledging that our autonomy within these systems is structurally limited? Thank you so much, Ayanda, for this question. I'm going to split this question in two and ask Faith and Nadia to answer it. So for the first part of how do we meaningfully safeguard African value chains in a context where key digital and physical infrastructure is foreign owned and externally governed, I'm going to ask Faith to answer that. And that will go together with how do we think about benefits in terms of these agreements when we're using US control platforms. And then I'll take the second half to Nadia, but over to you, Faith, first.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Yanda, for that question. It's how do I say, it's a thought-provoking question. It's more a question where you sit with it, and really, I think it makes me think about the future of the AfCFTA more. And with this question, I ask myself, what is it that the 54 African countries who've signed, ratified, negotiated for the AfCFTA, how comes we don't see potential in this agreement in such a way that we move away from having to depend on foreign trade preferences? Because really, at no point are we going to expect to have so much leverage in such an arrangement, right? Like that kind of relationship is never going to allow us to say, listen, for us to give you that, we need this. It's always a point of dependence. It's more dependence each and every time. So when I think about Ayanda's question, I think I would say we really need to move away from foreign dependency. And people say aid for trade and all that, but at some point, it's more about African countries, heads of state, private sectors, and trade negotiators really sitting down and intentionally putting their minds to see that Africa is benefiting first from this AfCFTA trade agreement that we have. And then if we are to negotiate as a bloc, then we use what we have, which is the AfCFTA trade agreement and its protocols, to negotiate for what we want and what benefits us. So my answer to that would be, honestly, the AfCFTA needs to be more revamped and made to trade, made to work. Yeah.
So you're saying what we need to do is shift to our own models and our own platforms. We don't really have control over these foreign-owned platforms. And we have that mechanism for trade, at least, with the AfCFTA agreement.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
Faye. Nadia, is it enough to access the market, or do we need to rethink what advantage looks like when the rules and digital gateways are not ours? That's the first question. And finally, how do we negotiate trade arrangements that promote digital inclusion while acknowledging that our autonomy within these systems is structurally limited?
Yeah, is market access enough? No, that's my view, and I think for people that come from my school of thought, market access alone is never enough. We need to be thinking about capacity to access the market, and then the value that is retained within our markets. And I think that's to the first part of the question. So when we look at the value addition, what we're seeing, like, for example, with AGOA, is that the textile industry has developed a lot, but hardly anything else has. And most of the other exports are raw material exports, and our alternative market, China, again, tariff-free, but unprocessed extractives. And so when we're looking at adding value, sometimes, our governments try to do these self-bans. So we say, okay, we're not going to export anything that is not processed or this type of raw material. Liberia has done it with rubber. Some countries have done it with cocoa or minerals. But we need to have the capacity to add that value. And then those those products may not fall under those trade agreements or those preferential market access again, and we have to know how that's going to work. Where the trade agreements come in, really, the meat of the trade agreements really happens in its implementation, and that happens at national level and sometimes at regional level, and maybe now a little bit at the continental level. So we really have to look at the implementation, and the provisions in these trade agreements, or in this case in AGOA, is what we have to look at closely in terms of how they limit national regulation. So do these agreements or our participation in them, in those trade relationships, does it limit our ability to nationally regulate some of these things, to insist on local content, to insist on value addition staying domestically? So there's a regulatory aspect, and then there's the capacity aspect. I would say, as we're looking forward, especially in our relations with the US, we're probably going to be looking more at reciprocity, right? That this AGOA was initially framed as aid for trade. Now it's really more of what can we exchange? How can both of us benefit? And here, probably looking at critical minerals. And so we really have to be careful about this. We've already seen data become an issue here. We've seen development aid become an issue. And with the market that we're talking about, the level of uncertainty that's there has risks to investment. It has risks to our supply chains. And so we should really be thinking about diversification. AfCFTA can help us get there in terms of value addition, in terms of new markets to access. But we should really be thinking of that diversification and value addition and other target markets in this context.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadia. And thank you for mentioning critical minerals. That will be in our third and final session in this series, where we will have some experts coming to talk to us about critical minerals and trade and how that's affecting data governance and AI governance. There is another question here from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, how do we balance the responsibility in ensuring that CSOs do not get overwhelmed? What can we do to ensure that there's a balance? As my fear is that CSOs have been built in capacity, but access to AfCFTA has been challenging. There are many case studies that have showed that trade is included and advocated by CSOs, such as the MDPMI in South Africa. So the question is, how do we ensure that the CSOs are not overwhelmed? Chiti and Mustafa, I'm coming to you with this question. They're saying, what is the balance for CSOs? CSOs are being asked to do everything from grassroots, and now we're telling you guys to also be part of trade negotiations. How do we ensure that balance? Maybe we can start with Chiti.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. How do we ensure CSOs don't get overwhelmed? I don't know about you, but every person I talk to who works within the space already is overwhelmed. It's a passion for the work, and it's just also you're fighting many fires and targeting many issues. So I think for me, the main thing, and I think it's an ethos that we all have within our organization, is you kind of have to also have a focus. I think there's a tendency to get overwhelmed. As much as we're saying, don't work in silos, I think we need to become a lot more targeted around the issues that we're targeting, the issues that we want to focus on. And I think I go back to the coalition building idea. There's way more strength in numbers. We also have a lot more research capacity, advocacy capacity than we are sharing and than we are making known to one another. So I think the first step in not getting overwhelmed is sharing information with one another, having spaces where exactly what Mustafa said actually about, we are tackling this issue on digital IDs. You are tackling this issue on data protection. How can we work together? Where can we lean on each other? What lessons can we take from each other? What strategies can we combine together? And that way you find that you're all kind of different pieces of one elephant, I would say, right? You're all tackling certain issues, but they come together in one coalition or one movement. And I think that helps to take away the strain. It also helps to prevent, I think what also causes quite an overwhelming sense within CSOs is that we find that in some cases you work so hard towards something and you are duplicating efforts or you are duplicating resources. Whereas if you had knowledge that another CSO was working on a certain topic or a certain issue, you could avoid that and actually move the movement a lot further. So I think that's what I would say. Coalitions, knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, and just ensuring that we're not duplicating our efforts and our resources.
Okay, so essentially better coordination among CSOs and better skilling and around these issues. Mustafa, briefly, how do you...
You can never have balance when the burden is left on a chosen few. Balance comes when it's shared, it becomes a collective responsibility on everybody. That if you're working on ID, you have a responsibility on trade. When you're working on land, you have a responsibility on trade. Everybody has a collective responsibility towards this field. And that's how, if we build pool our human resource, our financial resource, our knowledge together, we can avoid the aspects of burnouts, we can avoid the aspects of leaving the burden on a few people to run the show. And then we will be able to have more faith, more Chitis and more Mustafas in the room because we have cross-pollinated across the different fields by giving everybody a skill. Thank you.
Okay, now I know I said I had a final round of questions for everyone, but I feel like we've sort of touched those questions in some of the Q&A. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to give us their parting shot. I have my parting shot in mind, but I'll be a good moderator and host, and I will not go first. And for this, we will start in the reverse. Mustafa, parting shot for this webinar.
Well, the parting shot is that even the US has recognized the aspects of digital trade that was left out in AGOA. They've realized the aspects of digital rights that was left out in AGOA. So us as civil society should also recognize the fact that these are pertinent issues that we should all be engaged in, and we should have more touch points that is convened by CPIT. So I'll take it back to CPIT and say, you have the burden and the task. We will help you not to have burnout by coming in as co-facilitators, but you have the burden of convening all of us. Thank you so much for creating the space.
Thank you, Mustafa. I've heard you loud and clear. We will do more of these activities around trade. Chiti, over to you, parting shot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melissa and CPIT for creating this space. I think for me, I'll speak, from a digital rights perspective. I think that it's so important, especially when we're looking at trade policy dynamics and these agreements coming into our region. It's so important that we, the inclusion aspect of these issues and the impacts of these agreements on inclusion, particularly of vulnerable and marginalized groups. It's important that we as civil society in the digital rights space really focus on highlighting, monitoring, and reporting on these impacts, particularly on these groups which can be so easily forgotten within these broader discussions.
Thank you so much, Chiti. I'm glad that you brought in M&E. I can tell that you're pro in this work. Monitoring and evaluation to display impact is quite important. Next, Faith.
Thank you so much. I think my parting shot would be, again, very controversial. I don't think we should, as Africa, as private sector, we should still bank on another round of AGOA renewal. I think we should open our minds, and I think we should be awake to the reality that it's either we go reciprocal with the US or we just focus on our own trade agreements. This does not mean, though, that I don't acknowledge the impact of US-Africa trade. I do, and US-Africa relations. It's a good market. It's one of the best that we have duty-free access to the US market. But we have to look at the fact that there's going to be annual review eligibility, and that means we need to comply with things like rule of law, human rights, certain policies that we need to implement. So we need to be awake to that reality and start thinking forward and start having a transition strategy for what happens after 2028. Are we still going back to the same room, submit the same comments, and tell them, hey guys, we need another 2 years extension? We need to really be awake and look at what is happening. I mean, the US and Canada already starting to have issues in terms of tariffs. Who are we? Who exactly are we, right? So we need to be awake to that. And I think this would be more for I would say state parties and heads of government and whatever, like the public sector, to make sure that the AfCFTA is really being implemented. And that goes as well for the private sector, because the heads of state are not going to do anything if the private sector is not really pushing and saying, we need this trade agreement, we need to trade on this trade agreement. So it goes for both ways, but that means as well that we as academics, as trade policies and policy analysts, and everyone who's doing a bit of their part in the AfCFTA community, we need to make sure that that conversation is still being pushed forward. Otherwise, we really cannot have a lot of foreign dependency in this age and era.
Thank you so much, Faith. Yes, geopolitics are determining what is going to happen next. Even this renewal of AGOA to December 2028 was a surprise. We were supposed to be negotiating in December of 2026, but here came the renewal. We don't know if it will pass the House though. Okay, Nadia, parting shot.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really glad that Faith, Mustafa, and Chidi have gone first, because I think mine is to sort of say that building on what Faith has just left us is, let's look at the reciprocal arrangements. Let's look at what we are likely to see as bilateral trade deals. This particular trading partner has been very clear that they're looking for reciprocal agreements. They're looking for things that are consistent with their national interest. We also need to be looking out for our national and continental interest. So what I would say is civil society needs to come together with the private sector. In this particular context, trade agreements are economic. Despite whatever sustainability issues we try to integrate in them, they are economic agreements. And so you need to work with the economic actors. There is no way around this. And that is why we are more likely to be pushed, I think, into the bilateral arrangements, or if we can get our act together, negotiating together as either a regional bloc or an EAC was trying to do, and or as an AfCFTA bloc. But we need the national policies that will help us retain that local value. We should also be looking at diversification. This is an unpredictable trade situation. There's a lot of uncertainty. So look at diversification with other markets. It's not a silver bullet. AGOA never was. And I think maybe with Dr. Melissa for SIPIT, what I can offer on the capacity building side that Mustafa and Chiti have spoken about is we do have a framework that we built with the AfCFTA on integrating capacity building within trade discussions with public-private dialogue. And that covers both the public sector and the private sector and civil society. And maybe that's some model that we can take from what we have built on the continent and apply it to our exposure to trade agreements with other countries, with civil society together. So I hope we can also take that forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And I want to thank this wonderful panel who brought their expertise, their insights, and their personal experience dealing with these issues to this panel today. You have been a fantastic panel. I have thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you also for your parting shots. And thank you as well to our participants who have left comments and questions in the chat and in the Q&A. My parting shot is that this is just the beginning of the conversation. I remember a few years ago, if you talked about trade agreements and negotiation of trade agreements, you'd be talking about intellectual property and more specifically access to medicines, right? And that was a big issue, especially for us as Africans on the continent. And we can see where concessions in that led us to after the COVID pandemic. I don't need to get deeper into that. So my parting shot is, now that we are gathered at a point where we are all at the same space for AI governance and data governance. We are not too far left behind. We should not concede too much space to others. We should try and really define for ourselves what makes sense for the African continent. We have the AfCFTA as a mechanism. There are questions around the influence around the AfCFTA, but we do know that the protocols have been thoroughly negotiated with different voices. And those of you who are CSOs, you have been challenged here today to speak with the private sector and to speak with government. In academia, we call that the tripartite model of government, private sector, and CSOs coming together to find a solution. We need to definitely move together. Now, this webinar was right in the middle of two other webinars. So it is the meat in the middle of the sandwich. We are going to close on the 16th of September with more direct conversations around where we think that Africa should be focusing its eye on: critical minerals and labor within the digital economy space, because we are thriving in producing there, but we are not thriving in benefiting. So please join us again next week. My name is Dr. Melissa Omino, and I have been your host. I am the director of CIPIT, which is the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology at Strathmore University. And I'm also the Africa coordinator for the Tech, Trade, and Geopolitics Forum. Asante Nisana, and see you again. Bye.